He broke the world record for pull-ups, which seems directionally different than marathon running, but it was a 24-hour record.
Someone who didn't have this lengthy, extensive background in running, and all of a sudden they're running sub 2:30 marathons. I think that's incredibly inspiring. You can't just work harder and expect to become an elite runner. That element of genetics is going to play a role. Oh yeah, I was like, who let this guy into this Olympic trials 10K? Like he belongs at Burning Man. You get a lot of quote unquote gym bros who are like, yeah, I'm gonna do high rocks. And then they realize that, oh my God, my aerobic system is just not up for 8 by 1,000 at a pretty hard intensity with all of these metabolic types of strength or other types of exercise thrown in the middle as this giant circuit. I do really like more muscular guys getting into the sport because it shows it's not just for us really skinny dudes. It's for everyone.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Welcome, everyone. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform and YouTube. You can now also check out the full video episode on X. Please also consider sharing your favorite episodes and leaving a review. If you do that and tag me or send me a screenshot, I will enter you in a monthly raffle for a free 30-minute consultation with me. For full episode details, including notes, timestamps, transcripts, and the show Patreon page, and other ways to support the show, please head over to my website at zachbitter.com. There you can find all my coaching services, including some new offerings for 2025. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter, where I have been publishing my training journal weekly, as well as other topic-based posts. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on my website or at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio Nutrition, and Training Peaks for supporting the podcast. I have links and promotions to these brands in the show notes, but you can also get them here. If you want to check out Element Electrolytes, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That'll get you a free sample pack with your first purchase. At deltagketones.com, if you enter promo code BITTER20, you will get 20% off your next purchase. And if you go to probionutrition.com, enter promo code ENDURANCE, and that will get you 20% off your next purchase. If you're interested in getting deeper into your own training data, head over to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. All right, Jason, thanks for kicking off the start of my 2026 podcast recording. I'm excited to have you on and chat about a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah, it should be fun, Zach. Thanks for having me. Hopefully we can start 2026 off with a bang.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to be an exciting year. So I've got a lot of topics I want to chat with you that range in a little bit behind just like your own running experiences, just your philosophy with running and how you use it with coaching people and creating educational material on your podcast and online, and some stuff within all of that. But maybe we kick things off with a little bit more of a fun topic, Truett Hanes. So
let's go.
This was fun. I think this has probably just popped up in the last couple of days with the new year. And Truett's just been someone who's been kind of fun to follow the last year, because a lot of people listening to this will probably be familiar, but he broke like the world record for pull-ups, which seems directionally different than marathon running, but it was a 24-hour record. So you do get that kind of endurance, just I got to be dialed in for a long period of time type of focus. But he switched directions after that and just started like really focusing on running and had quite a bit of success. I think he ran a 2:25 on a downhill marathon course and like a 2:29 high at CIM, which I think surprised a lot of people because he put that goal out on the table pretty early in the year and then got it, but then followed that up quickly by saying, okay, my next goal is now to run a Olympic trials qualifying time. So online running grabbed that and went a bunch of different ways with it, because I think there's like the two camps. One is, oh, this is a natural progression for him. And then there's another camp that's, yeah, that next 10, 12 minutes is going to be incredibly difficult to get compared to the big chunks of time he was able to take off. What are your thoughts? Has he got any shot at it? Is this a zero chance or above zero chance for Truett?
Look, I'm someone who wants to see him succeed because I think it's good for the sport. I think he's bringing a lot of eyeballs to the marathon and really to what almost a non-runner can do, someone who didn't have this lengthy, extensive background in running, and all of a sudden they're running sub 230 marathons. I think that's incredibly inspiring, and he was running a lot of marathons in jeans, which wouldn't be my first choice of attire for a marathon. But again, it's bringing attention to the sport. So I think it's cool. You know, improvement in running gets exponentially harder the faster that you get. So I would say that going from a 3-hour marathon to a 230 marathon, that's easier than going from a 230 to a 218. Even though we're talking about 30 minutes on one side and 12 minutes on the other, the faster you get, the harder it is to keep chopping time off of your personal bests. So on the one hand, I want him to be successful, but on the other hand, I think it's going to be almost impossible for him to run an OTQ of 216 in the marathon because I don't think it's a natural progression. That I think that's the conversation that a lot of folks are having, that, oh, he has taken so much time off of his marathon. He's getting to these very competitive levels. He's going to not really have any issue taking another, we could say 9 minutes if you want to compare it to the downhill time, or maybe about 13 minutes if you compare it to his flat CIM PR. That's an eternity. And I think the difference between a 216 marathoner and a 230 marathoner, that's like the difference between me and you, Zach. It's a chasm. It is a very wide gap in performance. It's not, 13 minutes between 216 and 219 is not the same as 13 minutes comparing 330 to 343. So I'm very cautious about saying he's going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I find interesting too is there is this thing where he didn't really take running seriously at all until this last year, but he did run. It wasn't like he was just like only doing strength sports. I think I guess it's like a funny story is his dad made him do cross country. Cam made him do cross country, and he didn't really want to do it though. He hated running. So you do get that conversation of, if we're looking at Olympic trials, we are getting to just a genetic capability. We're getting to that range where it's like all the hard work in the world isn't going to turn an NFL offensive lineman into an Olympic trials marathoner. You're going to need some genetic gifts to probably get down to that. And then the question becomes, how much of that do you need versus just putting in the work to continually improve and then having that day where you finally just connect all the dots. And I find this one to be really interesting with him because I do think if you look at, I don't know what his high school times were like, but it looks like he was on JV his junior and senior year for cross country in what I think was a pretty small school. So that would suggest he wasn't like running fast times with no training. And in the middle school, high school age, a lot of times you can maybe tease out natural ability versus training improved pace or training induced improvements because nobody at that level really has a tremendous amount of training under their belt. So maybe he doesn't have the genetic predisposition to run something at a trials because he didn't run like a state caliber time in high school with no training. I don't know. I have a hard time balancing it with my teaching background too, because I do know there are kids who, when you get above about the 800 meter, they just aren't going to try. They're just not going to try. So it's like they may have the ability, but like just they're so deterred by that distance component that they don't even really put their true natural ability on display at any point.
Yeah, I think you're completely right about the whole genetics part of this. If you want to run an elite level time, you have to have elite level genetics. And it's just the draw of the lottery, and choosing your parents and making sure that you have those gifts. No amount of hard work is going to make your average person into a 205 marathoner. It just doesn't work. It reminds me of something that, PhD Chris Napier, who does a lot of research on super shoes, said on my podcast. And he said, you can't continuously adapt to something in perpetuity. This idea that, we were talking about minimalism and the craze of minimalist shoes back around 2010. And he said, you can't just adapt to barefoot running. And then all of a sudden, you're capable of running 100 miles a week with all your workouts and races in no shoes at all. You can't get to that point. And I think the same is true here. The same analogy works. You can't just work harder and expect to become an elite runner. That element of genetics is going to play a role. And, it's just one of those things where, the other thing that I think has to be discussed when we talk about Truett is the fact that, if he wanted to run a 2:16 marathon, he might need to take some time away from the marathon and work on his speed, because I'm not sure if he has the motor, the actual wheels underneath him to support the speed that a 2:16 marathon really depends on. If you can't run, a really fast mile or 5K, you probably don't have the VO2 max and running economy and literally the speed underneath you to support the speed required for a 2:16 marathon. I always think in terms of like equivalent performances. You're never going to run like a 2:16 marathon, but then only be able to run a 5-minute mile. You're going to have roughly equivalent performances across most distances. And of course, that's going to fall apart a little bit on the extremes. Your 100-meter time might not be very relevant. Your 100-mile time might not be super relevant to, your 5K time. But for the most part, he's going to have some pretty good middle distance times. And, if I were advising him and he really wanted that 2:16, I might say, let's spend 12 to 18 months really working on those middle distance times. Let's drive up your running economy. Let's drive up your VO2 max. Let's just focus on personal bests across a whole variety of distances from, 800 meters all the way up to 10K. And that, I think, from a developmental perspective, would be really effective at helping him get further along this road. I don't know if he'll ever get to the destination, but I think it would help him get closer.
Yeah, you preempted my next question beautifully there. I was going to ask you, if it were you, how would you go about this goal? Because I guess when I first read that, maybe it was just all the New Year's resolution and the yearly reports that you see at this time of year. But I guess my mind immediately went to that was his target this year. And I think he's not closing that door of being like, hey, there's a scenario here where by December of 2026, I have a trials qualifying time. But I guess he didn't necessarily say that was the end all be all. And if he doesn't get it, he's moving on to something else. I think it could possibly be a multi-year project for him. But that kind of got my wheels spinning. So how would I do that? And I think you're 100% right. For somebody who hasn't done a lot of racing as their primary kind of target event, starting with some 5K, 10K, half marathon training this year would maybe put himself in a really good position to launch the marathon trials project, so to speak, in the beginning of next year. I really would like that scenario, just to see what he can do in some of those other distances. And then also, I think that's probably puts him in the best position for all those reasons that you said.
Yeah, like I always like to look at kind of the example of some of the best runners in the world, and almost to the person. Every really good marathoner first had a pretty good middle distance career. And that's the typical progression. Everyone likes to talk about Eliud Kipchoge, the only sub-2 marathoner, almost a world record holder. He's the GOAT. People don't realize he's also one of the top 10 fastest 3,000 meter runners of all time. And so he's had this incredible middle distance career before he ever went to the marathon, which I would argue paved the way for him becoming one of the greatest marathoners to ever live. And so I think this is just an issue of development. So it's honestly how I coach runners who want to be good at the marathon. I look at their other race times. If you've never focused on a 5K, that's where a lot of your improvement is going to come from. And so if I were, coaching Truett or advising him in some capacity, we would talk about focusing on the 5K, 10K, somewhere in those distances. I'd want to know what his running volume was. If we can't increase it a lot, maybe we can rely a lot on some cross training. I would want to build an enormous base. We probably can't do that with 140 miles a week. He probably doesn't have the experience and the history to get his mileage up that far. But, can we do another 4 or 5, 6 hours of, zone 1, 2, maybe 3 aerobic cross training every week. That to me is a really good avenue for, building the aerobic system in a very safe way, while at the same time we're focusing on speed for the running portion of his training. That would be, one of the starting off points. But, honestly, one of the ways in which I've had success with a lot of runners is talking through their training history and just figuring out what they haven't really been focusing on in the last 1 to 2 years. And whatever they haven't been focusing on, that's what we're going to start injecting a little bit more of into their training, because it probably represents an area of underdevelopment that has the potential to provide a lot more stimulus and improvement for future progress.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with that. I think that's always a fun way to look at things. Is it almost becomes something where it's, where are the holes that haven't been touched on? That's probably going to drive the most progress in terms of what we're going to get in the short term if they have a lot of training history. And then also when you go back to maybe some of the stuff that they had been doing more, also have some higher ceilings to strive for versus butting up against an artificially low one because of those spots that just didn't get hit. So Truett is interesting with respect to volume too, because I think he ran almost like 5,000 miles last year. So he was hitting some pretty high volume, but that might just suggest that he can tolerate a lot of that in a fairly quick amount of time. It could also suggest that maybe we'll start seeing some injuries or some fatigue that maybe is from ramping in quickly. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see one way or the other. I'm sure he'll be putting on a show. So
yeah. So if he is running that much, maybe volume isn't like the lever to pull to get him to a whole nother level of performance. So maybe I wouldn't add a whole bunch of other cross training. If he's running 5,000 miles a year, my God, I tried so hard to run 3,500 miles a year when I was competitively training and racing, and I couldn't get up there because of my injury history. So that is a lot of mileage. And, for me, I don't know if that's the lever to pull. He's also a pretty big dude. If my memory is correct, maybe he has a little bit of upper body weight to lose if he's okay with that. I know a lot of guys probably aren't, but if he's okay, maybe losing 5 or 10 pounds, that might be 5 seconds a mile on his marathon.
Yeah. And it's going to come down to seconds per mile for him at some point. So it is interesting. Yeah, that's also just an interesting variable in general too, because when he started his marathon training back in early 2025, I think he was like 180 pounds. And I think he got down into the mid to low 150s by the end of it. So he probably did get quite a bit of progress from that first one in early 2025 to the last one he ran at CIM, just by shedding some of that upper body muscle that he had put on prior to taking on the marathon stuff. But maybe there's a little bit more to squeeze out of that for him. He still certainly looks big and strong compared to most Olympic trials marathoners.
For sure. You look at Truett next to the Olympic trials marathon field, and he does look a little bit out of place. And, there's this like truism in all sports, like sports select for a certain body type. Sumo wrestlers are going to look different than world-class marathoners. And part of that is, your body adapting to the work. And part of that is, the right body kind of choosing the right sport. Not to say that you can't sumo wrestle if you look like me, or, run if you're a little bit bigger. But, at those really high level performance levels, you have to start thinking about that. And so he does probably have a little bit of progress if he has, that upper body mass that he could afford to lose. Probably doesn't want to look, your typical skinny runner like me, but might be necessary for performance.
Yeah, I do find it really interesting if it would be a case where he'd be standing on the Olympic trials marathon starting line looking substantially stronger than the rest of the group there. Almost you remember when Noah Droddy did he had that breakout like track 10, I think it was a track 10K. And he looked every bit like a 10K runner, but he had the long hair, sunglasses, a backwards hat on. So he kind of stood out compared to everyone else that had the speed cuts, the jersey tucked in, and no hat on.
Oh yeah. It was like, who let this guy into this Olympic trials 10K? Like he belongs at Burning Man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I say that as someone who has met Noah. I love Noah. Nothing against Noah, but he did look a little out of place. I found that hilarious.
It was awesome.
I think if we do have a muscular Truett Hanes on the starting line of the trials marathon, it might open up the sport to more gym bros who might think, hey, I could actually be quite successful and still maintain, the muscles that I've worked so hard for. So maybe it'll be a good thing for the sport.
Just a quick reminder, Training Peaks is one of the best tools for monitoring your training progress and my go-to tool when coaching individuals. At Training Peaks, you can get deep into the data, assess training load, recovery, and easily monitor progress across all training intensities. It is a perfect example of a program that takes much of the guesswork out of your training and coaching experience. I really love assessing intervals on Training Peaks. One of the first things I'll do when I get back from a run is I'll hop onto Training Peaks, unpack all that data, and just see how each of those individual intervals went and really dive into where I could maybe improve in the future. So if you're interested in getting deeper into your own training data, head over to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. Yeah, absolutely. And I think just that general trend, I'd be curious what you've seen with just the people that you've engaged with online when you're doing educational stuff, people reaching out for coaching and advice and stuff like that. If you've seen a shifting in the type of person that has come to you in the last few years, because I know for me, like when the David Goggins of the world and the Cam Hanes of the world started popping up and deciding, hey, you know what, we're non-traditional runners, but we can do these 200-mile races. I started getting a lot more inquiries from people in those environments that those guys were typically hanging around in. And it did open up the sport to a whole new group of people who otherwise would have maybe not considered it. So have you been seeing much of that on your side?
Yeah, there does seem to be a little bit more interest in running from people who come from, a strength training background, people who come from, just other athletic types of backgrounds who now want to, see what they can do in running or run their first marathon. I've seen a lot of folks who used High Rocks as a jumping off point into the sport of running. And then, High Rocks is this very interesting race. I look at it almost similar to the demands of a half marathon with a whole bunch of maybe CrossFit inspired types of exercise thrown in there too. So it is a very challenging aerobic endeavor. And so you get a lot of, quote unquote gym bros who are like, yeah, I'm going to do High Rocks. And then they realize that, oh my God, my aerobic system is just not up for 8 by 1,000 at, a pretty hard intensity with all of these metabolic types of strength or other types of exercise thrown in the middle as this giant circuit. And all of a sudden, they're reaching out to running coaches so that they can improve their performance over this. So I've seen people come from a variety of different backgrounds, whether it's strength, whether it's High Rocks, whether it's just people who, play pickup basketball. And I think they're inspired by people who aren't traditional runners doing either long distance races or getting into the marathon, performing really well in the marathon like Truett. And I think it's just great for the sport. It really opens it up to people who, they think the sport is all, guys like me running around in 1-inch split leg shorts. Yeah. And, I'm here to say anyone can wear the 1-inch split leg shorts and, they're for everyone.
Right on. I love it. Yeah. It's fun to see the sport grow and open up to, different communities and people with different interests. And I think too, just having someone like Truett come in and have a lot of success can probably lighten a little bit of that mindset around, running has to be this catabolic sport and to some degree it is, like we were talking about before, where your body is going to try to optimize within what you're putting it through. But as you know, it's like the sport of running has had its fair share of history with like body weight issues and things like that too. So I think just like generally speaking, we get outside of like elite Olympic performance and things like that, people just knowing, hey, I don't have to try to look like an Olympic marathoner to run a really strong race and get really close to my genetic potential within the framework that works well for me from a lifestyle standpoint.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the problems with running is that the images of runners that the public sees, and especially men, are not images that men often want to look like. Yeah. Right? Let's be honest here. Yeah. Runners are typically very skinny. When I'm talking about at the elite level, the pictures that we see at the Olympics and the World Championships and things like that, when you look at the starting line of the trials marathon, you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to look like those guys because it looks like they can't do 7 push-ups, and that is a problem. So I do really like more muscular guys getting into the sport because it shows it's not just for us really skinny dudes. It's for everyone.
Cool. Awesome. I do want to rewind a little bit and hop into some stuff, maybe a little bit more specific to you. And there's some, I think, fun topics within this where you've been recording the Strength Running podcast now for right around 9 years. So you were what I guess most people would call like an early adopter to the podcast platform. I can't imagine there were a lot of running specific podcasts out when you first launched the Strength Running podcast.
Surprisingly, there were. And I thought I was late to the game. I was like, oh, there's already enough podcasts. I don't want to jump on the bandwagon. I feel like I'm just doing the popular thing right now. But yeah, so probably a good lesson here is it's never too late to start because you might actually be early and it just feels like you're late. But yeah, I am going to be celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Strength Running podcast later this year. I think at the very end of October. We are getting up to close to 450 episodes at this point, and you'll actually be getting published on the show for the second time this week, the week that we're recording, Zach. So I'm excited about that. I'm also starting 2026 off the right way. And yeah, it's been a journey. I did not treat the podcast the same way that I do now when I first started it. When I first started the podcast, I was really focused on 2 pieces of content a week for the most part. And that might be an article, a video, or a podcast recording. And now it's more of its own separate standalone thing. And so it gets 1 episode a week in perpetuity. It's a weekly show. Yeah, it's been a wild ride. I don't think I wanted to start a podcast, almost like I didn't want to start a blog back in 2010, but I realized this was one of the things that you have to do if you want to teach on the internet, for lack of a better phrase, reach runners. I think it's a wonderful way to have interesting conversations. And now it is probably the most fun that I have with all the different types of content that I create. I probably enjoy the podcast more than anything. I just love having these in-depth conversations, learning more about the training process and what different subject matter experts and elite runners are doing with their training. I've always been super interested in training theory and physiology and exercise science. So it's a wonderful way for me to scratch my own itch at the same time as hopefully giving runners some of the resources they need to build better training for themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's just something that's cool. You get to a certain point where your podcast is performing well, and just as a piece of that process, you end up getting better access to, guests that really have the answers that you're trying to, or the answers to the questions that you're trying to ask at a very professional level a lot of times. So I think it's just really cool to be able to go in and talk to someone who's really in the lab or in the field as a coach and producing some really cool stuff and be able to get into the nuance of it a little bit versus just what we see fly out on the short form stuff on social media.
Yeah, my podcast is definitely an answer to some of the short form stuff that, look, I enjoy consuming myself a little bit and I produce a little bit of it. But at the end of the day, man, I'm such a long form guy. I love podcasts. I love movies. I love hardcore history, which is 5-hour long podcast episodes. It's basically an audiobook. And so I really love it. And to your point about getting access to the people who can answer your questions, that really hit home for me earlier last year when I was having a conversation with Phil Skiba. Phil Skiba is one of the exercise scientists who worked on Nike's Breaking 2 project. And so he helped with, some of the training methodology and other aspects to how Kipchoge was going to run a sub-2 marathon. And it was almost like in the middle of the conversation, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, having this very out-of-body moment, like, you are talking to one of the sub-2 physiologists. This is so cool. How did you get here? This is awesome. This is like my dream job. So yeah, I'm having a great time. And yeah, it connects me with people like Phil, people like you, Zach. So it's a dream come true.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, you mentioned the Super Shoe stuff, and that was something where I really leaned on the podcast a little bit with trying to get answers to things or really try to unpack that world. because when I switched to doing no shoe sponsorship last year, I had like this opportunity to try anything I wanted to. And some of it was like you see so much online about like efficiencies and how this shoe is going to perform versus that shoe and things like that. And I had both Jeff Burns and Dustin Jopert on the podcast who do a lot of that research. And it was fun to talk to those guys and really tease out the marketing from the actual results. And then one thing that kind of stood out to me, there was a couple. One was that, you get a lot of the marketing in the shoe world around, okay, this shoe is going to be for 5K, 10K. This shoe is going to be maybe like marathon or something like that. And one thing Dustin told me is, you know what? He's like, when I get people in the lab and we test for efficiencies, really the questions we're asking is, or what we're trying to answer is, what pace are you targeting for the race you're trying to train? Because we're going to want to find the most efficient shoe at that pace for you. And then from there, it's just a question of, can you tolerate that shoe for the duration of the event? So if I have somebody who's doing a marathon, but for whatever reason, they're more efficient in the shoe that's marketed towards 5K, 10K, as long as they can handle that shoe for the full marathon, it's like, that's the one they want. That one I thought was really interesting. The other was like the foam durabilities too, where I remember when super shoes first came out, it was like, oh, you can't get much miles out of this. And that kind of got maybe catapulted further when Adidas launched their Evo Pro series, where it was like, oh, this shoe works for one race and it's $500. And I remember asking Dustin about that. I think there's a lot more durability with those foams than maybe people think, where he would test a pair of, I can't remember which Nike it was, but it was their Zoom X foam. And it had the exact same efficiency at 400 miles as it did at the first time he wore it. So there's just a lot of cool stuff within that, where when you start talking to the people who are really in the lab with it, you can find out some cool, interesting things.
Yeah, my God, don't throw away your super shoes then, right?
No kidding.
You can wear them a lot longer than you think. Yeah, I think that stuff is super interesting, especially the way in which shoes are marketed. If a shoe is built for, say, the 5K, but you're going to run a 10K or a half marathon at a pace that would otherwise, be considered a 5K pace for someone else, that might be the right shoe for you. And so targeting a shoe based on an event distance, unless it's like a 100-meter or 100-mile race, the extremes, I think that's a really interesting kind of way to think about super shoes, or really any racing shoe, because isn't it more about the pace than the actual distance that it's built for?
Yeah, and you do get a stability component in there for sure, especially when you get to those longer distances where the efficiency and stability tend to contradict each other a little bit. So you get like probably the best example in the market right now is the Puma Fast R3, which is just a blazing fast shoe, but it had to give up some stability to get that fast. So it may not be the shoe for everybody if they can't make it for 26.2 miles in that shoe. But if you can, and we know some people do, then that might be the ticket for you to get a little bit of extra progress out of it.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to remember about super shoes is that there's no free lunch. There is some extra stress that you're going to be experiencing in these shoes. And maybe extra stress isn't the right way to put it. It's just different stress. And they do just behave and act in a different way than normal shoes. And so, yeah, I had this conversation with Chris Napier. I've also had Jeff Burns on my podcast. He's brilliant. Just talking about some of the, the trade-offs that you get. Yeah, and I think that's a helpful way of thinking about things. Trade-offs. Yes, it's faster. Yes, it's going to return more energy. Maybe the foam is reducing some of the force that you are experiencing through your legs, but you might be experiencing more force at the ankle or for the plantar fascia, for example. And so being a little more gradual with how you're working the shoe into your rotation and finding a shoe that personally feels good. I'm a big believer in just that subjective feeling of, this shoe feels good on me. I feel confident running workouts or long runs in this shoe. So that's probably a good shoe for you. Those are just some consideration with super shoes. I know for myself personally, I grew up, Zach, in the era of minimalism. Most of my races were in like Nike waffles. And I really struggled moving up to the longer road racing distances when I started running them, because I came from this cross country and track background. And we always wanted to find the lightest shoe that we could find. And, I remember my 10K personal best is from Franklin Park in Massachusetts, this kind of famed cross country course. And I remember this race because I was wearing the Nike Streak Zoom XCs. You can look this shoe up. It's basically a slipper. I have no
Yeah.
idea how I ran 6.2 miles, at whatever pace that I was running. I don't know, 520 or something in these tiny little shoes. And then I tried to go onto the roads and I really struggled finding a shoe that gave me the support that I needed that wasn't a trainer. And so now I try to run in super shoes and I feel like I'm on this very squishy jello mold and I can never find stability because of my background with the more stable, more minimalist shoe. So I'm one of these people that struggles a little bit with super shoes personally. And I need something that has a little bit of a good base to it to feel a little bit more stable.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it gets into a broader topic that we can hit on too, which is just the strength work and strength component to running and programming, things like that. But the shoe transition from minimalist, essentially maximalist with the super shoes is a pretty stark difference where I look at just like shoe lineups and it's there used to be a place for a minimalist shoe essentially on almost every catalog because you'd have a racing flat, which you could argue is basically a minimalist shoe for most cases. Now it's like your racing shoes are going to be stacked up as high as you can get away with for the most part. So it's the opposite end of the spectrum. And like you, I explored the minimalist stuff. I like to think I took it to its logical conclusion by getting up to 100 miles and the lightest shoe I wore is like 3.9 ounces, just basically a thin strip of rubber under your foot. And I don't know, like it was just like when you said like switching over to wearing like super shoes now, you feel maybe a little bit more of a variance than someone else is going to that weren't playing around with as much low profile stuff at one point. And I definitely did have a little bit of a transition when I started wearing those shoes where my hamstrings, I'd never had hamstring issues in my entire life. And then all of a sudden I started to have to pay attention to that. And yeah, just like the relative like wobbliness that you're going to get in that versus a lower profile shoe. Thankfully, I had moved away from like real true minimalist shoes before the super shoes. So it wasn't like a total 0 to 100 in terms of shoe variants, but it was enough where I definitely noticed the difference.
Just a quick reminder that Pro-Bio Nutrition is my go-to supplement for all my micronutrients and digestive needs. The reason I like it is it was developed by my good friend, Dr. Mark Bubbs. He has had a lot of experience working with successful individuals that have busy, active lifestyles, including Olympians, NBA basketball players, professional hockey players. One of the things he noticed was a lot of supplements were not only mislabeled, but not very effective. So he went about to try to lower the friction point there by making it as easy as having one scoop of Pro-Bio Nutrition every day. I will take it with either water, smoothie, or mix it in with my yogurt once per day, and then I'm done. And I can rest at ease knowing that along with a good diet, I'll have all those micronutrients and digestive needs met. Head over to probionutrition.com and enter promo code ENDURANCE for 20% off your next order.
When you said I took the super shoes to their logical conclusion, I thought you were going to say a stress fracture.
Yeah. I didn't actually ever get any. I actually look back at that and I do wonder if I just had some relative strengths within that world of just lower leg durability for one reason or another, because I've never had a stress fracture in the lower leg. I've had a couple sacral stress fractures, but that was that was after I was doing more of the minimalist stuff. But yeah, it was, I did a ton of miles in those type of shoes. So I had a lot of friends who would get stress fractures just from racing flats, wearing them periodically versus exclusively. I don't know, maybe I dodged a bullet. Maybe that was just a relative strength for me, or who knows?
Yeah, you just might be like particularly suited for more minimalist shoes, perhaps. Whereas, some people might be more suited to the maximalist approach. So it just goes to show different shoes for different people.
Yeah. And it is just one of those things because I think we talk about the injuries with different footwear and things like that, whether it be stress fractures from a minimalist shoe or hamstring issues from a super shoe and that sort of stuff. But what doesn't get talked about as often is the people who got away from injuries because of this. And I think you do see that with the super shoes too, where there are people who are chronically getting injured. And then for whatever reason, with the advent of some of these new foams, now all of a sudden they're consistently able to hit higher mileage than they were able to do in the past and stay more injury resistant than they had before. So there's that whole side of it too.
Yeah, it just goes to show, like, whenever I'm asked, are super shoes a good idea to wear for my workouts, maybe my long runs for races? It so depends, right? Like, some runners are going to be high responders to super shoes. Some runners may not really experience too much of an effect on their performances. And some runners might really dislike it and they don't like the feeling. It doesn't really work for them. And so from a performance perspective, you're going to have people all over the map. And I think the same is true for injuries. Some runners are actually going to be a little bit more protected by super shoes. Some runners might not see an effect, while others might be a little bit more at risk of certain injuries. So yeah, like, it's one of these things where there are no clear-cut answers on, whether or not it's going to work for you or you're going to feel good in it. But yeah, that's where the experimentation comes in. And I think working to find what works for you individually, not listening to, whatever the shoe marketing is or whatever your buddy at Run Club says, is probably the best option.
Yeah, no doubt. I do want to dive into strength work a bit here. And maybe we start with, just since that's a component of your podcast and interest of yours, let's just rewind back, because that's one thing I noticed really shift within my running career, where early on, strength work was viewed as this thing where it was like, you know what, if you have time to get in the gym and do strength work, you're probably better off just doing more of what you were doing before, like more running and get your volume up, get more training quality in there and things like that. And I think the running community really did view strength work a lot as just not just something that was neutral, but like detrimental to like your progress from a performance standpoint. And that started to shift towards where I think people started recognizing that there's definitely a value add to it, to the degree where having some sort of strength program or some structure around that is probably in your best interest. Was there a moment in time where you had an aha moment within that, or were you always into strength work as an endurance athlete?
No, I was definitely not always into strength work. And to be honest, Zach, I'm getting this reputation as like the strength training running coach. I don't even really like strength training. I would rather be out running. The only reason I'm such a proponent of strength training is because, one, I understand the benefits of it almost reluctantly. And number two, it just allows runners to do more of what they love, which is running. I'm a big fan of any training intervention that makes your running more productive, that lowers your injury risk, that makes you into a better runner. I was someone that didn't really lift at all, but my aha moment was a very serious IT band injury after my first marathon. So I ran the New York City Marathon in 2008. Felt good during the race, up until I completely hit the wall at mile 20 in the most cliched performance you can imagine. But it was after the race where, I took about a week off and I started running a little bit after the marathon. And I wasn't doing anything long or difficult, but my IT band started to hurt. And this just progressed into such a severe injury that I didn't run for about 6 months. I went to see 4 physical therapists who weren't really resolving the injury very much. And part of this aha moment for me was in the education process, because I saw 4 physical therapists, and, in between sitting on the couch, feeling bad for myself because I wasn't running, I was trying to figure out, why is this injury happening? What can I do to resolve it? And this was at a time when there wasn't a lot of content out on the internet. And so I was really searching and trying to find these little bits and pieces that did exist. But, part of this aha moment was me starting to do some of the things that I learned from the physical therapists, some of the things that I learned, through my own research. And I put it all together into this kind of, somewhat newer approach to my training. And I got healthy. I eventually went and ran a faster marathon, and I didn't get hurt afterwards or during any part of the process. And so I started realizing that a certain amount of strength work is preventative. It helps you stay healthy. And it also just makes your running better. You're going to feel a little bit more capable. You're going to be able to absorb a little bit more training. I like to think of strength training as armor. It protects you a little bit from the impact of training, the stress of training. And, then I became a believer. And it went from, let's do mostly body weight stuff, a lot of the things that you'll do in a PT's office. And then that gradually morphed into my current approach, which does include heavier weightlifting in the gym, a little bit more focus on explosivity and power, some of the things that you might need at the end of a race when you're trying to sprint and kick hard to have a good closing, segment of the race. And so it's been this full circle moment for me. Like I remember in high school, one of my friends telling me to lift weights, and I was like, I don't need that. My legs get plenty of exercise through running. And now I'm the complete opposite where, let's do some strength training every week. We're not bodybuilders. We don't need to be in the gym 4 or 5 days a week, but a good 2-day a week strength habit in the gym is probably a really good idea for most runners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic when you start getting into the stages of acceptance, I'll call it, which is, okay, I should probably be doing some strength work, to, okay, now I'm committing to dedicating, say, 2 days a week to strength work. What do I actually do with that time and with the different potential options that you could do with it? And you get all the debates around just, should you lift heavy? Should you lift compound? Should you do single leg stuff, lighter stuff, body weight stuff? And then you can get in the world like plyometrics and muscular endurance routines and things like that. Do you have a general starting point for people when they're getting into it as to, let's see what we should do first just to get you exposed to this, and then have an order of how you go about those different types of strength work throughout the course of their development?
Yeah, I think a really good place to start is, number one, we have to recognize that building the habit of strength training is really important for runners, mostly because runners, by and large, don't really want to strength train. Hopefully, with the Truett Haneses of the world coming into the sport, we can change that a little bit. But, through my coaching experience over the last 15 years, most runners don't want to spend a lot of time in the weight room. I'd say maybe 20% of my athletes have a good gym habit, and I love that. But if you're new to strength training or you're not sure where to start, I think one of the easiest things to do is just, let's do some sort of, body weight strength or even core routine or workout after each one of our runs. And it acts as a cool down. It acts to build that habit. I think it's really helpful to think of runners not as just endurance runners, but as athletes that specialize in running. And so that opens the door to doing other forms of exercise. And I know it's a little bit semantics, and sure, we're runners, but this way of thinking about ourselves, I think, can be really helpful, because it then opens the floodgates to strength training, mobility, plyometrics, cycling, doing some cross training, whatever that might look like, and really thinking of yourself as a more well-rounded athlete rather than someone that only runs and that's their only form of exercise. And so if you can get into the habit of doing like a 10 to 15 minute body weight strength session after each one of your runs, where you're doing some basic stuff like bridges and side planks and, maybe some single leg squats. Maybe you're focusing on hips and glutes with, some good side lying leg raises, some clamshells, those kinds of fairly simple exercises that you might find in a physical therapy office. That's the starting point that I would often suggest, because it's this type of work that, it isn't really high effort. The hardest part about this is simply committing to the time requirement. You're not going to, deadlifting your max, 1 rep max is very different than doing a 45-second plank. And so I found the body weight stuff to be a really good entry point into strength training. It builds confidence. It builds that skill of adherence to strength training over time so that you can stay consistent with it. Because just like running, you can go on one 20-mile run, and that's probably not really going to do very much, but it's the whole body of work that's important, just like with strength training. So let's get into that habit. Let's do it consistently and regularly. And, I have this very simple concept of sandwiching your runs in between a dynamic warm-up where you might be doing some flexibility movements. You might be doing some light strength work. Maybe you do a series of lunges with some leg swings. You can throw in a couple other exercises. Then you're ready for your run. And after the run, you do that 10 or 15 minute body weight strength work. And so this is a really nice way of building a little extra strength, a little extra mobility. You'll build some extra proprioception and coordination and athleticism into your training as well. And then when you're ready for it, you can take the next step, which is actually getting into a gym and doing some heavier weightlifting. And like I mentioned before, 2 days a week, 45 to 60 minutes max. I'm a big fan of focusing on the compound movements, like squats and deadlifts, maybe some overhead presses, all the variations of those exercises. And there exist many of them. That's a really good starting place for most runners, just to build the habit and to get what I think are like the main benefits of strength training, which were probably improving your running economy and making you more resilient to the stresses of running.
Yeah, that was really well said. I love it too, because I think it is one of those things where when strength work first started getting popular within running, or advisable within running, there was this kind of back and forth conversation about, you take the average runner and throw them in a gym, they're going to probably gravitate towards the high repetition, low volume stuff because that's what they know, more or less. And then there's pushback on that. Why would you be piling on more of what you're already doing? You want to focus on heavier compound movements and things like that. But the counter to that then becomes, that's maybe a little bit of a higher level than what's going to be good starting point for someone who's never done strength work before in their life, or hasn't done strength work in years, if not decades. So I love what you said about first, let's just get in the habit so that we make sure that when we do progress within this, consistency is already going to be part of the process that's already locked in. And then what we do with that time can evolve as you learn more and can get yourself in a position where maybe doing some heavier compound lifts is something that's approachable and isn't going to be a scenario where trying to solve a problem creates the problem itself by creating an injury because you don't have good form or know what you're doing when you're picking up heavier weights relative to what you can do.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm a big believer too in, like when it comes to most training decisions, like I'm a moderate, rarely take extreme positions. And, I think you can structure strength training in a wide variety of ways and still get really great results. My position is mostly that strength training should be periodized, much like our running plan. If you're 16 weeks out from a race, what you're doing in the gym should look different than when you are 1 week out from the race. Just like your workouts are going to look a lot different points of the season. And so I think there's a place for, doing your 3 sets of 10, basic lifting, general strength. You're building that strength foundation. This is like base training for running. You're doing either no workouts or aerobic workouts. You're just doing strides, focusing on volume. Maybe you're working on a weakness here and there, but it's pretty general. And then as you get closer to your race, you can do more specific aspects of training. We can do the same thing in the weight room and, pull in some of the more advanced types of lifting later on in the season, like heavier lifts. Maybe we're doing some sort of power movement or explosive exercise. I do think plyometrics are a form of strength training. It's almost like a little bit of a hybrid between a drill and a strength exercise, but putting in some plyos to make you more efficient, to help translate some of your strength into speed. This is where I think we should be cautious, because I think plyos have a high risk of injury just because they're explosive. It's really easy to do too many of them. So this is why I like to have a coach or a trainer, someone with you, to really watch your form, make sure you're doing them right, and to not program too many of those plyos. And then as you get into the later points of your season and you're doing some heavier lifts, you're doing more of the explosive work and plyometrics, this is where you have to reduce the volume. Just like you're not going to do 20 miles at mile race pace. That is a funny workout. You're not going to do, 3 sets of 10 at your 3 rep max effort. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so you've got to cut the volume down while you're focusing on the intensity so that you're not taking away from your running. Because at the end of the day, we are runners. We're specializing in running. And anything that we're doing in the gym should be a supplement to our running. It should make our running better. And so if you're finding that you're so sore from lifting that you can't go for a run, or you can't hit the paces that you should be hitting on a workout because you're just fatigued or sore from lifting, then we need to either dial back the weight or the volume of the weightlifting sessions so that we're not interfering with running. Because at the end of the day, our sport-specific exercise, running, is the most important thing. So as long as you're prioritizing running and working through some sort of strategic approach to your weightlifting, then you're probably good to go.
Just a quick reminder that Element Electrolytes is my go-to electrolyte source. I know that I lose 614 milligrams of electrolytes for every liter of sweat. So on those training sessions, especially the hot days, I'll make sure I have a packet of one of their multiple flavors in with my fluids. Or if I'm looking for a refreshing post-workout beverage or just staying on top of electrolytes throughout the day, I will often lean to their cans of Element Sparkle, which are a very tasty treat after a hot training run. If you want to get a free sample pack with your next purchase, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the rules I've given myself is whenever I shift to a different type of strength work, whether it be doing the heavier compound stuff, the 3 sets of 10, like you mentioned, or switching to do more plyometrics than I had been, if it's been like a few weeks or in some cases months since I've really focused on that input, I just do a third of whatever I've done in the past. So if that's 3 sets of 10, I'm doing 1 set of 10. And then that gives me an opportunity to assess that next day or in that next 48 hours, is there anything that's standing out that feels a little bit behind the other stuff? Or am I noticing any soreness? And it kind of gives you a little bit of a baseline to build up from versus going in and doing that 3 by 10 right away. And then the next day you wake up and you're like, I just feel like I ran a marathon.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach, especially because I think it's really easy to overdo the first training session in the gym after a long break. I remember specifically when I first started lifting regularly, I went in the gym and I did a 30-minute workout. I even overdid that 30-minute strength workout, and it was a full body strength session. It wasn't like I was focusing on 1 or 2 muscle groups in 30 minutes. And for 3 or 4 days, I could barely move around. My mobility was so impacted. And so from that one experience, I have really tried to, reinforce the lesson that if it's your first time in the gym or first time back after, 3, 4+ weeks, just do a tiny amount of what you think you're going to do. It's almost like that first run back after a road marathon where you think you're recovered, but let's just run, an easy couple miles. And it's almost like a diagnostic run. We're just seeing what is going on with our body. Is our body going to be responsive to running? Are we going to expose any hot spots or niggles or really sore areas that we weren't really able to tease out when we're just walking around and going to the grocery store on a day-to-day basis? And so that first weightlifting workout, I think, needs to be very much like that. It's almost a diagnostic session. We're just trying to see how our body responds to it. So the goal isn't to build fitness, to build strength, anything like that. It's almost just a little bit of detective work. Let me do this little tiny workout, see how my body responds to it, and then I can build on it, 3 days later or so.
Yeah. Yeah. I always find it to be something where if starting gradual isn't a good option or isn't an option I have on the table, I have a timeline issue versus I'm behind issue. So I think a lot of times I try to build a long enough timeline where there's just plenty of room to explore a little bit within just like where your starting point is and where you want to be, so that if that ends up being a little bit longer, it doesn't become consequential in terms of getting done what you want to before whatever goal race you're training for.
Yeah. Zach, you just said something really interesting. You said explore. I think the gym is a wonderful place for runners to explore. So instead of following a formal program, and I'm saying this as someone who sells a formal weightlifting program, I also think there's value in exploration, in figuring out how your body responds to different movements, different types of exercises, single leg work, isolating smaller muscles and just seeing how that affects you. Because if you're exploring not just strength, but also different movement patterns, you're going to expose some strengths, some weaknesses. You're going to learn more about yourself as an athlete. I don't know. A question for you, Zach. Do you explore like this in the weight room? Because I know I certainly do. I follow a general pattern, but then I also throw in a couple random things just to get my body into a unique position. I just want to, feel a little bit different. I don't know. I think it's almost like I'm in a library browsing random books.
Yeah.
The same idea, except physical.
Yeah, no, it is something this is one of my favorite parts about training is I like the structure and I like having, the support of, okay, here's where I'm at. This is where I'm going to get if I do these inputs. But I do also the little bit more of, okay, let's go figure something out or solve a problem that I maybe don't even know that's there yet. And a recent example of that is I started to like implement more plyometric type movements into my training to start this year. And I've actually felt pretty decent about a lot of the forward movement type stuff, single leg hops and just jump squats or even jump split squat type things. That stuff all felt reasonably in a good spot relative to just like where my starting point would be and where I want to be. The lateral stuff that had a little more explosiveness to it, I was like, oh yeah, you don't play pickup basketball anymore, or you don't go outside and do things that require a lot of that sharp lateral movement. So just going in the gym and just playing around with a little bit of some different plyometric movements really showcased to me that was a pinch point in terms of something I'd want to both be mindful of that I don't do too much too soon for the reasons we talked about before, because I probably am very at risk of injury if I go in and just start doing like hundreds of side skips and things like that. but it is something that I want to improve, and I want to make sure it's not a weak point for me with the training that's coming up too. Yeah, I think I like doing that sort of stuff and trying out different movement patterns and different ways of loading it too, just to see where my strengths and weaknesses are at and how I might want to focus on those.
Zach, I don't think you're alone in lacking a little bit of lateral strength or stability as a distance runner. That's probably every runner's main weakness, I might venture to say. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I was just on a nature walk with my kids on Sunday. I had a big Friday, Saturday, and was feeling beat up. So I didn't run on a Sunday, went for a nature walk, lifted later in the day. But on that nature walk, I started doing some sort of lateral, almost like the defense drill with basketball. I used to be a basketball player before I was a runner. Sounds like you are too. We need to do some pickup balls sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I started doing some of these lateral movements and immediately discovered like the weakness, almost not of a weakness, but more of a lack of coordination doing that movement that I used to, as a basketball player, feel very comfortable doing, because, you're playing defense almost every day, and, you're just engaged in that very specific movement pattern on a regular basis. And then you start running and you're never engaged in that movement pattern unless you're doing like lateral lunges or something like that. You just don't get that stimulus. So I'm not surprised to hear it. I'm in the same boat as you, and it's probably a good area to focus on for pretty much every runner.
Yeah, what you described was perfect too. It's almost like you go through those movements and it's like this weird life transition of just, this used to just happen intuitively. Like I didn't even think about it. It's like my brain didn't even have to fire consciously to move in this direction. And now I have to like actually focus on doing it in order to reconnect with that and make that intuitive again. And yeah, I mean, you're out there on the basketball court playing when you're younger, and it's just, you move laterally because that's what you got to do to get to where you're supposed to be. And now it's, okay, I've got to really think about, okay, how am I going to land when I do this? And is it going to hurt or is it going to feel good?
Yeah. And, I think it offers this really good avenue for exploration in the weight room, because you can work on the things that we don't work on as runners. And we can think about like planes of motion here. And so we can think about the frontal plane of motion, which is that side to side, or the transverse plane of motion where we're rotating. So I think the gym is a great place to add in side to side movements that include some sort of rotation to almost provide a little bit of a counterbalance between, the very sagittal plane, front to back motion that we typically engage in with running, where, let's be honest, it's a fairly one-dimensional sport. We're running straight ahead as fast as we can. That's the sport. Of course, there's some other things involved a little bit, but the movement patterns are pretty limited in running. And so whenever we can expose ourselves to other movement patterns through dynamic flexibility movements that we might do as a warm-up, drills, plyometrics, strength training, forms of cross training, I think those are probably the 5 biggest ways that we can help ourselves be better athletes, not just better runners.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One topic that I wanted to chat about, maybe we can end on this one, is within ultra running, more so on the trails, but the trails dominate ultra running, so it's a broader topic within the sport, is these muscular endurance training workouts that I would put in the same category of, okay, you're going into a gym and you're doing a strength workout versus you're doing another running style workout and things like that. And I know you've had Scott Johnston on your podcast a couple times, and he's really popularized this, partly because he's coached some phenomenal runners who've had a lot of success just in general, but also recently with Ruth Crofton winning UTMB. And I think he co-authored his book about that introduced this to the ultra running world with Kilian Jornet. And then Tom Evans, also the male UTMB winner this year, is coached by him. So they're using this routine in their training. And it's been really cool between your podcast and a few others that Scott's getting out and talking about his coaching philosophy, his background, and the why behind these muscular endurance routines. So I would just love to hear like your take on first, what is like a muscular endurance routine and where's the value add to that? And maybe a third question, if you don't mind, is there going to be a variance for someone like myself who's running more on the road and the track type of stuff versus these mountain runners who are going to be going up steep 30% incline stuff when it comes to the need or the desire to do a routine like that?
Yeah, great questions. I think it's really interesting kind of the moment that we're in as we learn more about, muscular endurance and physiological resilience. And, they're basically trying to answer the question, like, how do you fall apart less at the end of a race? There's always going to be some sort of decline, especially if you're pushing yourself. So how do you limit that decline? And, I think muscular endurance is best thought of as like local fatigue. So it's literally fatigue in the muscles. It's not aerobic fatigue. It's not brain fog or neuromuscular kind of issues that you might experience. It's really when your legs start failing you at the end of a race. And I think anyone who's run a marathon, maybe a half marathon, but probably marathon or longer, gets to that point where you just start falling apart. Your legs are not turning over underneath you. And muscular endurance workouts try to address that problem. They try to address the decline in performance that you experience at the end of a race. So how do we do that? There's a lot of different strategies, some a little bit more effective than others. I think anything that is very specific to the demands that you're going to experience on race day is going to build muscular endurance. So if you're getting ready for, a very hilly 100-mile ultra and you don't want to fall apart at the end of it, you could do a hard hill session. And then your cool down could include, some more up-tempo, steadier paced running, which is going to mimic the very demands of, say, a Leadville 100-mile ultra. You can also do things in the weight room, where you're going to be targeting the very same muscles that you're going to be working. I think generally just getting stronger is going to be helpful. But if you want to get really specific, I'll borrow a workout from David Roche, who I know you've talked to. He does his mountain legs routine, which is basically, it's just a series of like single leg squats that he does for a certain period of time. I'm not sure if he focuses on a certain number of repetitions. It's more, do it for a minute or two. And the idea is to fry your legs. Like you just do it in a quick up-tempo fashion so that you just experience a tremendous amount of fatigue. And it's that stimulus which is going to be helpful at preventing the breakdown later on in a race. Another way to do it is to utilize, the repeated bout effect with downhill running, where, this is probably the most damaging form of running that runners can do. Anyone who's done a Revel race probably experienced this, where if you're running fast downhill, especially on a road, you're just experiencing so many eccentric muscle contractions that contribute to muscular damage that, this is literally why you're experiencing that kind of local fatigue at the end of a race. And so giving yourself a very strong muscle breakdown stimulus is actually a good thing in training. So doing, let's say you're training for a marathon and you want more muscular endurance. You don't want to fade after mile 20 like I did in my first marathon. So you might do like a 20-mile long run where the last 2 to 6 miles, depending on your ability, are at your, say, goal marathon pace. So it's a little bit faster than what you're currently capable of, but it's down a certain grade. And so the point is to beat up your legs a little bit. The point is impact. And I know that sounds a little weird. It's like the thing that we often try to avoid as runners, but it's also the signal that tells your body to get more resilient, to prevent some of that local breakdown that occurs. So I think it's really interesting. And, for any runner who might be quote unquote fast, but they struggle in longer races like a marathon with, finishing strong, with breaking down in the final 10K, which I know is very common. And in hindsight, this is the kind of runner that I was. And it shouldn't be too surprising. I'm a cross country and track guy who tried to do longer road races, struggled a little bit in the marathon. It admittedly wasn't my favorite distance, but I was struggling from a lack of muscular endurance, a lack of, we also could say physiological resilience. I just started deteriorating way too quickly at the end of that race compared with my abilities in, say, a 5K. And, there's a lot of things we can do. It's often now considered, I love this topic because it's like the fourth training metric that really matters. There's running economy, there's lactate threshold, there's VO2 max, and then there's your ability to withstand the deterioration of those things. And it's partly about muscular endurance. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting avenue for improvement because it's basically a metric of durability. And I think most adult runners, that's probably where a lot of their weaknesses lie, is in that durability factor. So if we can increase a little bit of muscular endurance, we're going to improve our performances substantially because we're just not going to be falling apart at the end of races.
Just a quick reminder that Delta G ketones is my go-to exogenous ketone source. I will take these after my big training sessions as well as during my long runs at lower intensity and longer races at lower intensity. You can get 20% off your next purchase by going to deltagketones.com and entering promo code BITTER20.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that really caught my attention with it was when Scott was talking about just the difference between global fatigue and that very specific fatigue, localized fatigue. And I was like, that makes sense because if my limiter in adding more training adaptation stressors is just everything that goes into going out for another run, but not going and doing some of these muscular endurance routines, then it's almost not a question of, if this is cool, but it's not as direct as something else, so do something else. Something else is no longer on the table for me for one reason or the other, but that is, that's a net positive. So I think there's probably going to be a fair bit of individualization within that, but I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of interpret what he was saying or maybe the reasoning behind some of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the way I think about it too is it's a relatively high risk thing to do, especially if you're doing the downhill running, if you're doing the really specific workouts, which are just going to be difficult just by their very nature of being specific. Some of the, the mountain legs that David Roche really likes, I don't really consider those too risky, but a lot of the other forms of building muscular endurance can be quite risky, but at the same time, they don't really take any extra time. So for, the runner who might be training for a marathon, who wants more muscular endurance so that they don't decline as much at the end of that marathon, it might be hard to go from, say, 40 or 50 miles a week to 70 or 80 miles a week. They might not have the schedule for that. But could they do 2 or 3 very strategic marathon pace long runs where they're ending down a hard decline? I think that's a valid training swap. You're not doing the things that take a lot of extra time that you may not be able to do. But if you're strategic, you can throw in, these really smaller bouts of, we'll call it a workout stimulus that have these outsized rewards. Things like, I think a heavy lifting workout has outsized rewards based on the time investment. A 10-mile easy run, the value there is if you can do it 100 times in a row, right? It's the big global workload over time. Whereas these individual downhill sessions or, a big long run with 12 miles at goal marathon pace, maybe on varied terrain, those things are a really strong stimulus that you don't need a lot of. So I think we should differentiate between the two types of stimuluses that you could potentially get. The ones that are great, that don't take any extra time, it's just restructuring a workout, but that do have relatively high risk, versus something like mountain legs, which, does take some extra time, but has very little, injury risk for the runner. You're probably not going to get hurt doing a bunch of single leg squats off the back of your car, holding onto the door, you're probably safe. But, a big downhill session has a pretty high risk of injury.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point too. You have the injury risk of just the downhill running and then also doing quality at the back end of something that's fatiguing. You're just running up against your body's ability to withstand that to some degree, which is always an interesting consideration just in general, but with these things as well. So the other thing I always think about too is just having enough flavor in the training to make it exciting. And this is definitely going to be a little bit more on the individual side of things, but going in and doing like the mountain legs type stuff, or the one I'll do is it'll be like box steps, jump squats, forward lunges, and jumping split squats are the 4 that I'll do. And sometimes it's just fun to do that. It's like, it's different. It's a little bit new at times if I'm bringing it in after not doing it for a while, and just keeping training exciting enough where you're reaching the fatigue tolerance you have with enough flavor that it's still fun. Because at the end of the day, we've got so many different activities we could be doing other than running. Might as well make it as fun as possible within reason.
Yeah, I think about that too. Us learning about some of these new kind of training approaches or way of structuring things, it just gives runners a new little wrinkle to add to the training process, a new additional way of prompting adaptations, of driving additional progress. So I think it's super exciting.
Cool. Awesome, Jason. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you about all these different topics. Before I let you go, though, I want to make sure that you can share with the listeners where they can find you and anything you want to let them know about.
Oh, thanks. Well, strengthrunning.com is my home base. That's where you can find our blog, our training courses. The Strength Running podcast is also, I'd say, actually very similar to yours, Zach. It's a more training and science-oriented podcast. I like to think of my listener as a pro runner, and I want to surround them with other pro runners and sports psychologists and PTs and strength coaches and running coaches and all the support staff that might enable an elite level performance. I want to bring that to the recreational runner. So that's the kind of podcast that I have. I hope it's interesting to some. And of course, there's the Strength Running YouTube channel where I give a little bit more bite-sized training advice and often try to film it out in the mountains of Colorado here where, at least we can have a fun background.
Yeah, you got a great background over in Colorado. Cool. Awesome, Jason. Thanks a bunch for coming on. I'll have to have you back on down the road and dive into some more topics.
Yeah, thanks, man. This was super fun. I loved geeking out on all these training topics, which is right up my alley. And it was a blast having you on my podcast, which will be live, I think, when this episode goes live.
Yeah, we'll be able to, hopefully we can convince a few people to listen to both of them.
Yeah, I know. They're going to be sick of us probably a little bit, but I know I made that joke offline to you. I hope you're not sick of it because we talked
they can get the listeners can get a 3-hour experience if they want.
I love it. Thanks a lot, Zach. I appreciate it.
Yeah, take care.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.